Imagine building something so grand, so colossal, that even the richest family in America couldn't ignore it. Something meant not just to impress, but to dethrone the Breakers, the Vanderbilts' Gilded Age masterpiece in Newport, Rhode Island. But what if I told you that someone actually tried? That there once stood a mansion so extravagant it was designed specifically to outshine the Breakers, and that its story ended not in triumph, but in utter ruin. A dream built on ego, wealth, and a desperate need for recognition, now buried under decades of decay and silence. This is the forgotten tragedy of the mansion that wanted to be king. To understand why anyone would even dare challenge the Breakers, we need to step back into the late 19th century, when Newport wasn't just a quiet coastal town, it was the playground of America's ruling class. The Vanderbilts, the Astors, the Wetmores, the Ulrichses, they all came here every summer to flaunt their fortunes. The streets were lined with what they called cottages, though the word is laughable when you realize these were 50-room palaces designed by the best architects in the country. Every party, every ball, every dinner was a competition. Who had the better view of the Atlantic? Who had the grander ballroom? Who had the newest marble imported from Italy? It wasn't just about living, it was about displaying. And in that glittering, ruthless environment, the Breakers was the undisputed champion. Built by Cornelius Vanderbilt II in 1895, it was a monument to money, 70 rooms, 125,000 square feet, Italian Renaissance opulence in every inch. The Vanderbilts didn't just want to enjoy luxury, they wanted to enshrine it, to make it unmatchable. And for a while, no one even dared to try. But every empire breeds rivals. And in this case, the challenger came from an unexpected direction, a man named Edward Julius Berwind. Berwind wasn't born into the kind of old money the Vanderbilts or Astors were. He was what they liked to call new money, which was practically an insult in those circles. His fortune came from coal, the black gold that powered America's railroads, ships, and industries. He was the president of the Berwind White Coal Mining Company, and his wealth was immense. But wealth alone wasn't enough for Newport's social elite. They cared about lineage, reputation, subtlety. And Edward Berwind wasn't subtle. He wanted in, and he was ready to pay for his invitation. By the late 1890s, Berwind had decided he would build a summer home in Newport that would rival, even surpass, the Breakers. His wife, Sarah Torrey Berwind, shared his ambitions. Together, they envisioned something that would make even the Vanderbilts pause, a mansion not just for living, but for domination. They turned to the most celebrated architect of their time, Horace Trumbauer, a young Philadelphia prodigy known for turning the fantasies of America's nouveau riche into stone and marble. Trumbauer had an almost uncanny ability to translate money into architecture. He didn't just build houses, he built statements. And what he designed for the Berwinds would become known as the Elms. Now, the Elms wasn't a copy of the Breakers, it was something entirely different. Where the Breakers was loud, gilded, and dripping in Italian opulence, the Elms was poised, symmetrical, and inspired by 18th century French chateaux, particularly the Château d'Asnières near Paris. It was a deliberate contrast. The Vanderbilts had gone for power, the Berwinds went for taste. Limestone imported from France, interiors modeled after Versailles, formal gardens that could rival any in Europe. Even the servants' quarters were masterpieces of planning and precision, but beneath that polished surface, the Elms was still a declaration of war, a challenge dressed in refinement. Construction began in 1899 and finished in 1901. The cost? Around $1.4 million at the time, equivalent to roughly $50 million today. The Berwinds spared no expense. They wanted the Elms to be the future of Newport society, the place where everyone who mattered gathered. The mansion was one of the first in America to be fully electrified, with a sophisticated network of switches and hidden wiring that astonished guests. In a way, it symbolized Edward Berwind himself, a man of progress and innovation, yet desperate for the approval of those who looked down on him. When the Elms finally opened, it was breathtaking. Guests stepped through marble halls adorned with frescoes, gilded ceilings, and French antiques, so rare that even European aristocrats would envy them. Outside, the gardens stretched like something out of a dream. Terraces, fountains, statues, all arranged in perfect harmony. Newport society took notice. For a moment, the Berwinds had done the impossible. They had built something so beautiful, so disciplined, that even the Vanderbilts had to acknowledge it. But beauty, especially in that world, came with a cost. Edward and Sarah Berwind poured everything into maintaining the illusion. The staff at the Elms numbered in the dozens, including footmen, cooks, gardeners, chauffeurs, and maids, each trained to uphold an impossible standard of service. Edward was known to be an exacting employer, running his household like one of his coal companies, with efficiency and discipline. He wasn't cruel, but he was cold, detached, a man who measured everything in terms of order and control, and that control extended to his social life. Berwind didn't drink, rarely smiled, and was almost militaristic in demeanor. He had friends in powerful places. He advised presidents and dined with princes, but among Newport's old guard, he was still the outsider. The Elms might have outshone the Breakers in elegance, but it couldn't buy acceptance. The Vanderbilts had legacy. The Berwinds had coal. Then, in 1922, tragedy struck quietly. Sarah Berwind passed away, leaving Edward alone in his marble palace. He continued to live there, almost mechanically, surrounded by portraits and silence. Servants still glided through the halls, silver still gleamed on the dining table, but the laughter, the music, the purpose, it was gone. Edward himself grew increasingly reclusive, rarely leaving the house as though he had become another piece of furniture within its walls. He died in 1936 at the age of 88, with no children to inherit his fortune. The estate passed to his sister, Julia Berwind, who, against all expectations, kept the Elms running through the Great Depression and beyond. She was eccentric, independent, and fiercely loyal to the house. At a time when most Newport mansions were shutting down or selling off furniture just to pay taxes, Julia kept her staff, paid their wages, and refused to close the doors. It was as if she was protecting her brother's dream, or perhaps guarding the illusion of what the Berwinds had once been. Neighbors whispered about her solitude, her odd habits, her insistence on preserving a lifestyle that no longer existed. When she died in 1961, the Elms was frozen in time, immaculate, untouched, like a mausoleum for the Gilded Age itself. But what came next was even more heartbreaking. With no heirs and enormous upkeep costs, the Elms was set to be sold, its contents auctioned off, the mansion likely demolished. Newport by then had changed. The era of lavish summer homes was over. These cottages were seen as relics of an indulgent past, out of step with modern America. Developers circled the Elms like vultures, planning to raze it for housing or a parking lot. For the first time, the grand rival of the Breakers faced the same fate as so many forgotten monuments to wealth, oblivion. And yet, against all odds, something unexpected happened. The people of Newport, many of whom had never set foot beyond the gates of the Elms, began to realize that losing it would mean losing a piece of their town's soul. For decades, these mansions had stood as symbols of excess, monuments to the 1% of another century. But now, as bulldozers loomed, sentiment began to shift. History, even decadent history, had value. Local preservationists and historians rallied together, determined to save what they could of Newport's past. Among them was a newly formed group called the Preservation Society of Newport County, a small, passionate organization that believed America's architectural heritage was worth fighting for. They had little money, almost no influence, and the clock was ticking. The Elms was scheduled to be sold and potentially demolished within months. But through sheer persistence, fundraising, and an almost obsessive devotion to the cause, they managed to raise enough to purchase the mansion and keep it standing. In 1962, the Elms opened its doors to the public for the first time, not as a playground for the elite, but as a museum. Visitors who had once only seen its limestone facade from the street could now wander through its gilded halls, marveling at the frozen perfection of another era. It was the first time the walls of the Elms had echoed with ordinary footsteps, the first time its splendor belonged to everyone. And yet, beneath the triumph of preservation, the story of the Elms carried a lingering melancholy. It had been built as an act of defiance, a statement of arrival from a man desperate to be seen as an equal to the Vanderbilts. But in the end, it became a monument to impermanence, a beautiful shell left behind by people who couldn't outrun time. You can almost feel it when you walk through the house. The dining room, once glittering with candlelight and silver, now stands quiet, still set as if expecting guests who never came back. The library smells faintly of old leather and dust, the clock on the mantel forever frozen at a moment that no one remembers. But to truly understand the tragedy of the Elms, you have to look deeper, beyond the marble and the myth. You have to understand the man who built it and the world that made him believe he had to. Edward Berwind wasn't simply trying to outshine the Vanderbilts for vanity's sake. His obsession with control, with order, with architectural perfection, it all stemmed from a deeper insecurity, one shared by so many industrial titans of his generation. He came from immigrant stock, not from the inherited aristocracy that defined old Newport. His money came from mines, from soot, from the labor of thousands of men who would never see the inside of a ballroom. And though he amassed unimaginable wealth, the walls of class in America were thicker than marble. You could build a palace, but you couldn't buy a pedigree. That tension defined much of America's Gilded Age, the uneasy coexistence between old money and new, between inherited elegance and self-made power. The Vanderbilts, for all their grandeur, were still once new money themselves. Cornelius Vanderbilt started with nothing but a ferry boat and built an empire of railroads and steamships. Yet within a single generation, his descendants were being accepted into the highest echelons of society, while men like Berwind were left on the threshold. Why? Timing. The Vanderbilts rose just early enough to shape the rules of the game. Berwind arrived when the gate was already closing. Still, Berwind tried to play the part. He hosted lavish dinners where senators and European nobility sat under ceilings painted with cherubs. He invested in art, architecture, and philanthropy, but he never quite cracked the code of social grace that defined old Newport. He was too rigid, too businesslike, too meticulous. He built perfection, but lacked warmth. And that's perhaps the greatest irony of the Elms. It's flawless, but almost sterile. Every chair perfectly aligned, every drape symmetrically tied, every statue precisely centered. It's beauty without breath, grandeur without life. There's an old saying that architecture is frozen music. If that's true, the Elms plays a symphony in a minor key. It's both triumphant and mournful, the kind of building that makes you marvel and ache at the same time. When you stand in its ballroom, you can imagine the string quartet tuning their instruments, the chatter of guests, the faint scent of perfume and champagne. But if you listen a bit longer, past the echoes, there's something else, a kind of loneliness that lingers in the air, the sound of dreams too heavy to carry. And yet, despite all that sadness, the Elms survived. That in itself is a miracle. Many of Newport's other mansions weren't so lucky. Dozens were demolished in the mid-20th century, their marble and chandeliers sold off in auctions, their land parceled for modern development. It's almost surreal to think that these homes, once worth millions, were considered worthless just a few decades later. That's the cruel joke of history. Grandeur fades faster than we think. Today, the Elm stands almost exactly as it did in the early 1900s. The Preservation Society has meticulously maintained everything, down to the linens and silverware. Even the servants' quarters remain intact, one of the few surviving examples of early 20th century domestic planning. You can walk through the narrow hallways where butlers once moved unseen, or descend into the underground tunnels used to bring coal from the street directly into the house's furnaces. Edward Berwind may have been cold, but he was efficient. He designed the Elms to run like a machine, and in some ways, it still does. What's fascinating, though, is how our perception of places like the Elms has changed. Once symbols of excess, they've become symbols of craft, of artistry, of what human hands and ambition can create when no expense is spared. People visit not to mock the vanity of the rich, but to glimpse a time when detail mattered, when architecture was meant to awe. We admire the craftsmanship now, the precision, the legacy of a world that, for better or worse, pushed boundaries of beauty. Still, behind every chandelier and manicured hedge, the Elms remains haunted by the question that built it. What good is perfection if no one truly belongs inside it? For Edward Berwind, the mansion was supposed to be his declaration of worth, his proof that he had arrived. But in the end, it became his prison, a symbol of everything he achieved and everything he couldn't buy. There's a strange poetic justice in the fact that today, anyone can walk through his home for the price of an admission ticket. The house that was once built to keep people out now survives only because it lets everyone in. And perhaps that's the real lesson hidden within those limestone walls. The Gilded Age wasn't just about wealth, it was about the illusion of permanence, the belief that money could freeze time, but no matter how grand the mansion or how thick the walls, time always wins. The Berwinds, the Vanderbilts, the Astors, they all wanted their legacies carved into stone. And yet, the thing that truly lasts isn't their fortune, but the story of their rise and fall. The elms endures not as a monument to victory, but as a monument to the fragility of ambition. Walk its gardens on a quiet afternoon when the light hits the fountains just right, and you can almost sense both the pride and the melancholy that built this place. It's beautiful, yes, but it's also a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the most magnificent dreams can turn to ghosts if they're built for the wrong reasons. And standing there, among the roses and the statues, you can't help but wonder, who really won the war for Newport's crown? Maybe the real answer is that no one did. Because in the end, the so-called war between these families wasn't fought with swords or words. It was fought with marble and pride. The Breakers, the Elms, Marble House, Rosecliff, they were all trophies of an age obsessed with appearances, each trying to outshine the other, each a little louder, a little more perfect, a little more desperate. And yet, when you strip away the gold leaf and chandeliers, what remains isn't power, it's longing. The longing to be seen, to matter, to leave a mark that time couldn't erase. That's what built the Elms. That's what destroyed it too. The Breakers still reigns as the symbol of Newport's extravagance, the ultimate expression of the Vanderbilt dynasty's confidence. But the Elms tells a different story, a quieter, more human one. It's the story of the man who built it not because he had to, but because he needed to prove something to himself. Edward Berwind was a man of the industrial age, a generation that believed in logic, precision, and control. He built railroads without tracks, corporations without compassion. His world was numbers, tonnage, dividends. But the Elms was his contradiction, a dream built not from necessity, but from insecurity. There's a certain irony in that, isn't there? The very house that was meant to elevate him above the crowd instead became the most honest reflection of his isolation. The more perfect the Elms became, the more imperfect its purpose seemed. It's as if Berwind tried to design himself out of existence, to build a place so refined that human messiness had no room inside. The carpets never wrinkled, the servants never spoke unless spoken to, and the schedule of the household ran with the precision of a clock. It was the ultimate expression of control, and the ultimate denial of life's unpredictability. But Berwind wasn't alone in that. Many of the Gilded Age magnates were haunted by the same paradox. They built empires to escape their origins, only to find themselves prisoners of their own success. The mansions of Newport weren't homes, they were masks. Behind every glittering ballroom was a man, terrified of being ordinary again. The Elms wasn't built for comfort, it was built for legacy. And when you build for legacy, you forget to live in the present. What's striking about the Elms is how alive it still feels, even in its silence. The furniture hasn't moved in over a century, yet you can almost sense the tension in the air, like the house remembers. It remembers the coal dust that paid for every marble column, the footsteps of servants running unseen through back corridors, the clinking of champagne glasses under chandeliers that gleamed brighter than the moonlight. It remembers the loneliness of its master pacing the halls, surrounded by art, but never by laughter. The house itself tells the story better than any historian could. Walk through this conservatory on a summer morning, and sunlight still filters through the palms just as it did in 1902. The scent of wax and age lingers in the air. You can almost imagine Julia Berwind sitting by the window with her dogs, the last guardian of a world slipping away. She refused to abandon the Elms, even when it made no sense to keep it. There's something heartbreakingly loyal in that. She wasn't clinging to wealth, but to memory. To her, preserving the Elms wasn't vanity. It was devotion. It's hard not to feel a little sympathy for her. Imagine living alone in that enormous house, year after year, as the city outside changed, cars replacing carriages, factories replacing fields, the world modernizing beyond recognition. Yet inside the Elms, time stayed still. Maybe she found comfort in that stillness, or maybe she was trapped by it. Either way, when she died in 1961, she left behind not just a house, but an entire era embalmed in plaster and silk. The people who saved the Elms after her death didn't just save a building, they saved a story. They rescued the last whisper of an America that no longer believed in limits, for better or worse, and that's what makes the Elms so haunting. It's not a ruin like so many European castles, crumbling from war or neglect. It's perfectly preserved, a kind of time capsule. You can almost fool yourself into thinking the Berwinds might walk in at any moment, but they never will. When you think about it, the Elms is a paradox wrapped in stone. It was built to rival the Breakers, but it ended up surpassing it in something more subtle, emotional weight. The breakers dazzles you with scale, but the elms lingers. It feels more personal, more fragile, more human. Maybe because it carries the ache of a man who wanted everything and, in a way, got nothing. Even the name, the Elms, feels understated, almost modest. Not a grandiose title like Breakers, which evokes the unstoppable force of waves. The Elms evoke something softer, trees, shade, serenity. But elms, like fortunes, are vulnerable. They grow tall and proud, only to be felled by blight or storm. Maybe that's fitting. Because for all its symmetry and strength, the Elms was never built to last forever. It was built to impress, to momentarily eclipse the sun, and then fade when its purpose was complete. Yet, standing there today, it's impossible not to feel awe. It survived when so many others didn't. The marble still gleams, the fountains still dance, the portraits still stare back with that strange mixture of arrogance and emptiness. And maybe that's why we keep coming back to stories like this, because they remind us that no matter how high we climb, time will level us all. The Elms isn't just the story of a house. It's the story of ambition unchecked, of beauty built on insecurity, of a dream too heavy to carry. It's about what happens when the pursuit of perfection replaces the pursuit of meaning. Edward Berwyn built his masterpiece to prove he belonged among America's royalty. But what he really built was a monument to his own loneliness. And now, more than a century later, that loneliness still echoes through every hallway. Maybe that's the real tragedy of Newport's grandest rival. Not that it failed to outshine the Breakers, but that it never needed to. If Berwyn had realized that his worth didn't need to be measured in limestone and chandeliers, perhaps the Elms would have felt like a home, not a monument. But that realization came too late. The coal dust settled, the guests stopped coming, and the Elm stood there, beautiful, empty, eternal. And as the sun sets over Newport, its shadow stretches across the lawns like a quiet reminder that everything magnificent eventually fades. The music stops, the lights dim, and what remains is the story, a story carved not just in stone, but in longing. When you walk the grounds of the Elms today, there's an eerie tranquility that hangs in the air. The laughter that once spilled from terrace dinners is gone. The sweeping driveways that once echoed with carriages now host slow, curious footsteps. Tourists murmur in hushed awe, as if they're intruding on something sacred. And maybe they are. Because the Elms isn't just a relic, it's a memory you can still step into. A dream frozen mid-breath. The gardens are a masterpiece in themselves. Two sprawling terraces overlooking manicured lawns that seem to stretch endlessly toward the horizon. The fountains still shimmer under the Rhode Island sun, though the statues that once symbolized vitality now wear a faint patina of melancholy. They're not just ornaments, they're witnesses. They've watched generations come and go, each one standing in the shadow of a house that was built to defy time and ended up proving its inevitability. The more you explore, the more you begin to sense the invisible machinery of the Elms. It was designed with astonishing foresight, a balance between grandeur and control that few modern architects could replicate. Beneath the beauty lies a labyrinth of servant corridors and hidden passageways, an entire world operating just out of sight. Edward Berwyn insisted that guests should never see the staff. Food arrived through concealed doors, trays glided silently, fires were stoked through panels hidden behind tapestries. Every act of service was invisible, as if the house itself performed the labor. It's genius, really, and a little chilling, a perfect metaphor for how the Gilded Age functioned. The shine of opulence above, the sweat of labor below. And those servants, they're the ones whose stories have almost vanished. But they kept the Elms alive. Butlers who rose before dawn to polish the silver, maids who memorized the order of every candlestick, gardeners who trimmed the hedges until their hands bled. They lived in small, neatly organized quarters tucked behind the glamour, their lives dictated by the rhythms of those they served. For them, the Elms wasn't a symbol of ambition or taste. It was survival. And yet, many remained loyal to the Berwyns until the very end. Some even refused to leave after Julia's death, unable to imagine life anywhere else. There's something hauntingly human in that devotion, a reminder that every empire, even one built in marble, stands on the backs of the unseen. Upstairs, you find the drawing rooms, the bedrooms, the spaces where the Berwyns entertained royalty and financiers. You can almost picture it, the glow of chandeliers, the clinking of champagne flutes, the orchestra tucked behind gilded columns. But when the music stopped, the silence must have been unbearable. That's the thing about grandeur. It's intoxicating when filled with life, but once empty, it feels heavier than stone. Every echo inside the elms sounds like memory itself. One of the most haunting rooms is the conservatory. Sunlight spills through arched glass, illuminating the marble floor in fractured gold. You can see the faint outline of where the original palm trees once stood, imported from Europe at an unimaginable cost. The air smells faintly of age, a mix of stone and dust and time. Standing there, you almost forget this was once a display of triumph, because now it feels like a cathedral of solitude, the kind of silence that's beautiful, but not comforting. And that silence isn't confined to the elms, it stretches across all of Newport. The same families who built their summer kingdoms here have long vanished, leaving behind hollow palaces that now serve as museums. The Gilded Age ended with the Great Depression, but its ghosts never really left. They linger in the walls, in the chandeliers, in the gardens that still bloom for no one in particular. What's left is a kind of collective memory of excess, a reminder of how fragile even the grandest dreams can be when built on pride. Yet, what makes the elms stand apart is how gracefully it aged. Where other mansions were gutted or turned into hotels, the elms endured untouched thanks to people who saw beyond its price tag. When the Preservation Society took over, they didn't strip it down, they kept it alive. They understood that history isn't meant to be repainted, it's meant to be remembered. Every imperfection, every worn patch of floor, every faded tapestry tells a truth money could never hide. And perhaps that's why the elm still captivates us. It's more than architecture, it's confession. A confession of what wealth can build and what it can't. It can buy silence, but not peace. It can fill a room with gold, but not laughter. It can construct eternity in limestone, but not meaning. The elm stands as living proof that the pursuit of perfection can end in emptiness. Yet somehow, through that emptiness, we find beauty again. If you look closely at the portraits in the dining hall, you can almost see the pride and fatigue in their painted eyes. They look like conquerors, but there's a hollowness there, a faint question lingering beneath the brushstrokes. Was it worth it? That's the question the elms keeps asking, century after century. Was it worth the fortune, the pressure, the loneliness? Was it worth building a monument to belonging only to find yourself more isolated than ever? There's something timeless about that question. You can hear echoes of it today, in every skyscraper, every startup, every mansion still being built for the sake of being seen. The scale changes, but the hunger doesn't. The elms was a 19th century mirror, but the reflection hasn't aged a day. It still shows us what ambition looks like when it forgets what it's for. Still, it's hard not to admire Edward Berwind. For all his flaws, for all his rigidity, he left behind something undeniably magnificent. He dreamed at a scale most people couldn't imagine. And though his motives were tangled in ego, the result transcended him. Maybe that's what great architecture does. It outlives its builder's intentions and takes on a life of its own. The Elms is no longer about Berwind versus Vanderbilt. It's about creation itself, about how beauty, even when born from insecurity, can outlast everything that inspired it. If you stand outside the elms at dusk, the light softens across the stone, and the air feels heavy with the scent of salt and thyme. The sea breeze carries a faint echo of the Gilded Age, the music, the laughter, the illusion, but all of it fades into the quiet hum of the present, and in that stillness, the elm seems to breathe again, no longer a rival, no longer a monument, just a memory that refuses to die. And maybe that's the strange magic of the elms. It failed to defeat the breakers, but in its failure, it became something greater, a story that outlived its ambition, a reminder that even the grandest dreams can crumble into something humbler, something truer, something human. There's a certain moment in the late afternoon, when the sun begins to dip behind the trees, that the elm seems to shift from house to apparition. The limestone glows faintly, catching the last of the golden light, and for a brief instant, it's easy to imagine the past breathing again, the rustle of silk gowns on marble, the quiet laughter of guests stepping through the gardens, the soft click of champagne glasses. And then, just as quickly, it fades. What's left is stillness. That's what makes the elm so powerful. It doesn't just show you history, it makes you feel the weight of everything that's gone. Newport has always had a strange relationship with its ghosts. The Breakers, for all its splendor, feels like a museum from the moment you walk in. Grand, impressive, but distant. The Elms, by contrast, feels personal. It draws you in slowly, like an old photograph that refuses to let go of your gaze. Maybe that's because it was never truly about domination, despite what people believed. Beneath its deliberate symmetry and precision, there's an undercurrent of longing. The Elms wanted to belong, and even now, you can sense that yearning in every corridor. And yet, it's that yearning that makes it human. The Vanderbilts built monuments to their triumphs. Berwind built one to his insecurities. And perhaps that's why his story resonates more than the rest. There's something tragically relatable about a man who had everything except the one thing he wanted most: acceptance. The coal baron who could illuminate a city but couldn't light the warmth of belonging in his own home. When you think about it, The Elms is as much a psychological portrait as it is an architectural one. Every corner of it speaks to control, order, and perfection. The symmetrical facades, the meticulous gardens, the marble interiors, all of it reflects Berwin's need to impose harmony on a world that never gave it to him. It's as if he was trying to design his way out of chaos. That same desire to build something perfect enough to quiet the noise inside is timeless. It's what drives artists, moguls, and dreamers alike. But at the Elms, you see how perfection can become a cage. The deeper you explore, the more you sense that duality, the beauty and the burden, the triumph and the tragedy. Down in the basement, the mechanical heart of the house still hums faintly with the ghost of efficiency. Massive boilers that once powered the estate stand like relics of an ancient engine, silent now, but still imposing. It's a reminder that beneath the gilded surfaces, the Elms was sustained by human labor, by heat, by the mundane pulse of work. That's the unspoken truth of every Gilded Age mansion. The glamour above was made possible by the toil below. In a way, it mirrors America itself during that time. The Gilded Age was a paradox of brilliance and exploitation, elegance and inequality. Newport was the stage where that contradiction played out most vividly. The Elms was its perfect metaphor, refined on the surface, industrial at its core. And perhaps that's why its story still captivates us. It's not just about one man's mansion, it's about an entire nation learning how to reconcile wealth and worth, power and peace. There's an entry in a 1902 Newport paper describing one of Berwin's summer soirees. The article reads like a symphony of excess, hundreds of guests, carriages lined for blocks, orchestras flown in from New York. It paints the Elms as alive, glowing with electricity and laughter. But what the papers didn't mention is that Berwind himself often remained reserved, even in celebration. He preferred watching from the periphery, ensuring everything went exactly to plan. He didn't revel. He supervised. Even in his moments of triumph, he was an observer of his own life. That detail, quiet and small, says everything. And then, of course, came the decline. After Sarah's death, the house began to take on an almost monastic atmosphere. Curtains drawn, routines maintained, servants dismissed quietly one by one as Berwind aged into solitude. When he finally passed, the Elms became Julia's world. Locals who saw her in her later years described her as polite but distant, a figure out of time. She would drive her car through Newport streets, one of the few women of her generation to do so, her small frame barely visible behind the wheel. And every evening, she returned to that vast, echoing house. No guests, no parties, just her and the memory of what once was. When you walk through her bedroom today, it feels different from the others. It's quieter, simpler, almost humble compared to the grandeur surrounding it. The bed neatly made, the light soft and subdued. It feels lived in, but not alive. And yet, that room may hold more truth than all the gold leaf ceilings combined, because in that space, stripped of spectacle, you see what remains when the music stops. And that's the quiet revelation the Elms leaves you with. Beneath the layers of wealth and history, it's a story about impermanence, about how even the grandest ambitions eventually meet the same end as everything else: silence, stillness, and the slow passage of time. But there's beauty in that too, because without endings, nothing would ever mean anything. Today, visitors come to the Elms expecting to be dazzled, and they are, but what lingers after isn't the marble or the art. It's the feeling, that strange mix of awe and sadness, the awareness that you're standing inside someone's impossible dream. You can see the fingerprints of pride and love on every surface, but also the fingerprints of loss. It's both a masterpiece and a confession, and that's what makes it timeless. As you leave through the great hall, the sunlight pours through the tall windows, catching the dust in the air. For a moment it looks like gold, as if the house is exhaling one last shimmer of its old glory. But it's just light, ordinary, fleeting, perfect only for an instant. And maybe that's the point the Elms has been trying to make all along. Grandeur fades, beauty fades, but meaning doesn't. Meaning is what survives when everything else collapses. And as you walk down those limestone steps, back into the world outside, you can't help but feel that the Elms isn't just a story about the past. It's a mirror, quietly reflecting the same desires that still drive us today. The hunger to be seen, the fear of being forgotten, the hope that something we create might last longer than we do. In the end, that's the true tragedy of the Elms, and the quiet grace that makes it unforgettable.